Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So, we have now seen the conclusion of the Day of Reckoning card in Saudi Arabia. And what we're going to do in this video is go through the winners and losers of each fight and basically speculate on what is next for each fighter, or who I would like to see each guy fight next. So pretty simple. We're going to start bottom to top here. Filip Hrgovic versus Mark Demori. Mark Demori, quite simply, never want to see this man again in a fight. As for Filip Hrgovic, he's in a good position as of right now. He is the IBF #1 contender, I believe. He's basically waiting in the wings for a title shot at this point. So he's in a great position. He could fight the winner of Usyk versus Fury, but I would think the winner of that fight will then vacate a couple of titles, possibly the IBF, which would mean Filip Hrgovic more than likely would fight Anthony Joshua. So listen, I think it's now the waiting game for Filip Hrgovic. I don't really think you'll see him all of that active, but he's got big fights on the horizon, so it's either going to be Joshua or the winner of Usyk and Fury. We move up the card. Frank Sanchez defeating Junior Farr by a 7th round stoppage. Junior Farr, I think his career's pretty much done. He's lost all his step-up fights, lost to Joseph Parker. He somehow lost to Lucas Brown, and now he's been stopped by Frank Sanchez. Junior Farr, maybe in New Zealand, has some domestic fights. Maybe they could do a rematch with Lucas Brown, but ultimately, Junior Farr is going nowhere fast. He's been relegated to the recesses of the heavyweight division. Frank Sanchez, interesting one. I think it's going to be hard to match Frank Sanchez in there with viable fighters in the heavyweight division, just because Frank Sanchez is, somewhat high risk, low reward, I would say. He's got a style that's hard to look good against, and he is dangerous to a certain degree. So it's going to be challenging with Frank Sanchez. Quite frankly, I think a fight that could make sense for him, believe it or not, would be Jarrell Miller. Now hear me out. Again, most top contenders are not going to fight Frank Sanchez. Jarrell Miller, despite losing, despite everything that's gone on, he does have a name within the heavyweight division, and that's who Frank Sanchez needs to fight. He needs to fight guys who can build his profile and build his case. Jarrell Miller could represent that sort of opponent for Frank Sanchez. I think stylistically, Sanchez should be able to keep away from Miller with his movement and just outbox Miller. So it's a very winnable fight also. It's a name. I would probably go Jarrell Miller for Frank Sanchez, because Miller's in a position where he's coming off a loss now. There's a lot of bad press around his name. He's going to take what he can get. So maybe Miller could be tempted into fighting Frank Sanchez. That's where I would go with Frank Sanchez. Daniel Dubois, interesting. He stops Jarrell Miller in the 10th round, 10th and final round. Good performance by Dubois, in my opinion. He needs to build on this, and I think there are several interesting fights out there for Dubois in the heavyweight division. One name in particular I would like to see in there with Dubois would be Kabayel, 2-time European champion, got a win over Chisora back in the day. Now he's exposed Arslanbek Makhmudov in a one-sided fight. He stopped Makhmudov in the 4th round. Dubois versus Kabayel for the European title makes a lot of sense to me. I think that's a really interesting fight at this point in time. Dubois stepped up twice prior. He got a Joe Joyce fight when he fought really nobody of consequence building up to that fight. It was a huge step up for Dubois, and he wasn't prepared. Then he got the Usyk fight, and once again, the competition leading up to the Usyk fight was low level. It was poor. I doubt he was I think he could have been more prepared for Joe Joyce and Usyk. Not saying he would have won. I don't think he would have, but he could have been better prepared with better matchmaking. Now it's time for Dubois to really start fighting other contenders in and around his level to try and prepare himself and actually earn a title shot. I think Kabayel is a good fight for him right now. I really do. Get the European title on the line. I think that's a good fight. Other names you could throw him in there with would be F.A. Ajagba. I think Ajagba is a reasonable opponent for Daniel Dubois. He's another guy I'd like to see take that fight. I think stylistically that's interesting as well. I think it should be fun. Both guys are flawed power punchers, so there's that fight also. Joseph Parker, maybe, who's just beat Deontay Wilder. Maybe that could be a fight for Daniel Dubois. But Dubois has options, in my opinion. I think he's got options in the heavyweight division. He impressed some people with his win over Miller, so we'll see where he goes. What about Dubois versus Zhili Zhang? I think that would end badly for Dubois, but it'll be a fun fight. My point is he's got options, and several guys out there could fit the bill for Dubois' next opponent. But I think Kabayel makes the most sense, to be honest. I think Kabayel could be tempted into taking that fight. Jarrell Miller. Jarrell Miller, like I was saying, he's basically got to take what he can get at this point in time. Frank Sanchez could be a fight for him. We're talking about these sort of guys in the heavyweight division, guys who can't really get a fight, guys who are somewhat avoided. These are the sort of guys we're talking about for Jarrell Miller, ultimately. I don't think he's going to get another big fight like Dubois, so he's going to be used as a stepping stone, I would imagine, for prospects. So yeah, we're talking about guys like Frank Sanchez, maybe Bakhmudov Jalalov for Jarrell Miller. That's the sort of guys he needs to be fighting now. Take what he can get, and maybe if he could win one of these fights, get himself back in contention, but I doubt that happens at this point in time. We move on. Arslanbek Makhmudov versus Ajit Kabayel. Makhmudov going into this fight as the favourite, the big puncher, but he got schooled and he got stopped. Now going in, I was fully aware of Makhmudov's technical deficiencies. We've spoken about it on the channel, but I never expected Kabayel to be the guy to expose it. I felt he could take him rounds, but I didn't feel he had the physicality to match Makhmudov. He proved me wrong. He put a beating on Makhmudov. We'll start with Makhmudov. Where does he go from here? Well, that was a one-sided beatdown. So, listen, we've seen his ceiling in the heavyweight division, but he's a flawed guy who can punch. I'll bring up the name again. F.A. Ajagba. Get Ajagba versus Makhmudov on the undercard of a big fight like a pay-per-view. That's a good undercard fight. Ajagba probably knocks him out, but it's a fun fight while it lasts. These are the sort of fights we're talking about for Makhmudov now. Justice Hooney is on the come-up. Maybe that could be a fight for him. Fabio Wardley, another one. These are the sort of guys Makhmudov should be targeting, in my opinion. And maybe if he could get a win over one of those guys, he can rebuild. But that defeat was so one-sided. I can't see Makhmudov ever really recovering from it in regards to the perspective of him like building himself to get a title shot or anything like that. I can't see it happening. So Makhmudov's future to me lies with just taking fun fights. Taking fun fights against guys at a similar level, maybe guys on the come up. These are the sort of fights he has to take now. That's his role in boxing, in my opinion. And maybe he'll win some, maybe he'll lose some. But yeah, pretty simple. Ajit Kabayel, in my opinion, delivered the most impressive performance on the card. Really good boxing display by Kabayel. I enjoyed the movement in the first round. He then started to up the pace, put his shots together, started to dig to the body of Makhmudov, and you could see him draining the gas tank of Makhmudov. Then he started to piece him up. Really, really good display by Ajit Kabayel. And he showed us what he can do. He showed us that his boxing ability is at a certain level. And I hope to see him in big fights now. I do. Dubois, like I said, I think Dubois versus Kabayel makes the most sense for both guys. Dubois still needs to prove himself, in my opinion, despite his performance. And I think Kabayel deserves a big fight. Dubois versus Kabayel would be very interesting. European title on the line, high-ranking positions on the line. That's a great fight. To me, that's the fight I want to see the most, would be Kabayel versus Dubois. But wouldn't be surprised if Kabayel is somewhat avoided, to be honest. And if that is the case, maybe we could have Frank Sanchez versus Ajit Kabayel, another guy who is high risk, low reward. So yeah, Kabayel hopefully can get some big fights on the back of this, but the Dubois fight is the one that really makes sense. In fact, what about Martin Bakole? That's a good fight, I think, for Kabayel. Kabayel could school Bakole, by the way. He could do something similar to what Michael Hunter did, but Bakole's a much better fighter than Makhmudov. So interesting fight there for Kabayel, and he's got a few options. Like I said, Dubois, Frank Sanchez, Bakole. These fights are there for him. We move on. Jai Opetaia. What more can I say? Best cruiserweight in the world, in my opinion. When it comes to Opetaia, there are titles out there. He recently got stripped of his IBF. I think the Briedis rematch would still be fun, to be honest. That fight is there for him. There's other champions like Chris Billum-Smith. I think he would smash Chris Billum-Smith. Arslan Gulamarian is there, the WBA champion. I think that's a decent fight. I think he'll give Opetaia a little work, but I think Opetaia is far too good. And aside from that, there is Noel Givor, who is the WBC champion. Again, good boxer at cruiserweight, but a guy in which I don't expect to give Opetaia any real trouble. Ideally, this is what happens with Opetaia. He has a super active 2024. He has 3 title fights, WBA champion in Gulamarian. He fights Chris Billum-Smith, the IBF champion. WBO champion. And he fights Briedis or someone like that. Try and get multiple title fights in, try and unify, and then maybe move up to heavyweight in 2025, or bridgerweight maybe, who knows. But I think Opetaia is by far the best cruiserweight in the world. And once again, he shows what you should do against this level of opposition. You're supposed to blast them out, and that's exactly what he did against Elizoro. As for Elizoro, I mean, he was just found wanting, wasn't he? Needs to go back down to domestic level at cruiserweight. We're talking about fights with the likes of Jordan Thompson, another victim of Jai Opetaia. Zorro versus Thompson makes sense. Zorro versus Lawal. All these fights make sense for Zorro, but yeah, domestic fights, in my opinion, for Elizoro. Anthony Joshua versus Otto Wallin. Very good performance by Joshua. Best I've seen him look in many fights at this point in time since pre-Ruiz 1. Really good performance. Dominated for Southpaw in Otto Wallin. Where does Joshua go from here? There's several fights I'd like to see Joshua take. He's highly ranked now within the IBF. If those belts become vacant after Fury and Usyk, Joshua could fight Hrgovic for the vacant IBF. There's that fight for him. If we're talking about money fights, maybe a third Andy Ruiz fight still has some legs. It's a rubber match. It's 1-1. They could sell that fight, you know. That would make sense to a certain degree. Plus, I think it's super winnable for Joshua at this point in time. So there's the Ruiz fight. There's the Hrgovic fight. Zhili Zhang is interesting. They've spoken about that potential fight for a long time. Back in the day, Eddie Hearn was always talking about Joshua versus Zhang in China, but I don't think Eddie realised just how good Zhili Zhang was at that point. Zhili Zhang's proven himself to be a very dangerous southpaw puncher. Will they make that fight? Probably not, but I have to admit, I'd love to see it. If I could pick any fight for Joshua next, I think that would be it, by the way. It would be Joshua versus Zhili Zhang. I think that's a good fight. And it's a money fight as well because, listen, Zhili Zhang brings a lot of eyes from Asia, from China. So Joshua versus Zhili Zhang is the fight I'd like to see. And listen, the elephant in the room is Tyson Fury. If Tyson Fury does beat Usyk, there's that fight. So Joshua's had a good year, a good rebound year. Two suspect performances against Jermaine Franklin and Robert Helenius, but he won those fights clearly, and he ends the year with a really good performance. So 3 wins, he's been active, he's climbing the rankings again. Big fights next year. Tyson Fury, Zhili Zhang, Filip Hrgovic, Andy Ruiz. There's fights for him. There's different options he can go down. So yeah, he's in a good place. As for Otto Wallin, go back down to European level, maybe try and win a European title, I guess. I always felt Otto Wallin was overrated by Tyson Fury fans. I think they was always coping when they made Otto Wallin out to be some sort of underrated killer. Tyson Fury just performed really badly that night. It wasn't because Otto Wallin was anything special, in my opinion. And I think we've seen his level tonight. Otto Wallin is a European level boxer with no power. And when a guy like that goes up against an elite heavyweight with explosiveness and power, that's what's supposed to happen. What we saw against Joshua. But Otto Wallin needs to drop back down to European level. I mean, I'm not really sure what's out there for him, to be honest. I've always found Otto Wallin pretty boring. Maybe I think at this point in time, maybe he'll be used as a stepping stone. Maybe Fabio Wardley versus Otto Wallin would make sense. Again, Justice Hooney versus Otto Wallin makes sense. Fraser Clark against Otto Wallin makes sense. These are the sort of fights I think you'll see Wallin in. Maybe you'll see Wallin versus Pulev, like a 42-year-old Pulev, for a European title. Who knows? But yeah, Otto Wallin, I'll be honest, I don't really care what he does from here. Never really been a fan. Don't like his style. Couldn't really care less what he does next, if I'm being honest. We move up. We continue to move up the card. Deontay Wilder versus Joseph Parker. Deontay Wilder losing a lopsided 12-round unanimous decision. Lost every round. How Michael Alexander and John Latham gave Deontay any rounds is beyond me. I felt this fight was easy to score 12 rounds to 0 in favour of Joseph Parker. And Deontay Wilder looked awful. Looked like he couldn't pull the trigger. He actually looked physically weak at times as well. I noticed that. His body didn't quite look the same in my opinion. Parker was much stronger. Wilder didn't want to engage. He got buzzed a couple of times by Parker. And yeah, looked like a gun-shy individual who was there for a payday. I think Deontay should retire, personally. I don't think he's got anything to offer now. I've seen people make excuses about ring rust and things like that. I just think he's past his best now, to be honest. But if Deontay were to continue, what fights are there for him? What would you want to see? Andy Ruiz, maybe? Maybe they could do that fight. I guess it would sell something. But where does Deontay go from here? If Dillian White beats his case, maybe Dillian White? These are the sort of guys we're talking about for Deontay Wilder, guys who are also shot or washed up. Derek Chisora, dare I say it? Derek Chisora versus Deontay Wilder in 2024? What about that? But yeah, after this type of loss, after this type of performance, I think Wilder's done. Wilder's done, and he should retire. But if he continues, honestly, I'd put him in there with guys like Derek Chisora or Dillian White if Dillian White can beat his case. You know, those are the sort of fights I'd make for Deontay Wilder at this stage. Maybe Andy Ruiz, you know. As for Joseph Parker, he really reinvigorates his career with this win. Puts himself right back in the mix, and now he's highly ranked once again. And I have to say, listen, I've always been critical of Joseph Parker. I've always felt he's lacked that mean streak, and I think that is still valid. I have to say, though, I want to give Joseph Parker a little bit of credit for his career. He's fought a lot of top guys. You know, got a win over Andy Ruiz, which aged pretty well. He beat Carlos Takam when Carlos Takam was a contender. He's now beaten Deontay Wilder, a former champion. He's got wins over Hughie Fury, a fringe contender, Derek Chisora, a fringe contender. He's got some decent wins, Joseph Parker, at this point in time. And even the losses, man, he fought Joe Joyce, tough fight. You know, he fought Joshua, obviously. Tough fight. He fought Dillian Whyte. Tough fight. That's when Dillian Whyte was actually a contender. You know, he's got a good resume, Joseph Parker. He's fought good guys. And, yeah, I just wanted to give him a bit of credit for that, to be honest. But, yeah, where does he go from here? Where does Joseph Parker go from here? Dubois is a good fight for him at this point in time. I think Dubois versus Parker makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. Does Joseph Parker want to avenge his defeat to Joe Joyce? Joe Joyce is coming off 2 losses now. Does that change things? What I wouldn't be mad at that fight if they make it next. Joe Joyce needs to climb the rankings again. And Joseph Parker's beaten Deontay. He's got ranking points. Maybe Joe Joyce would see that as a viable rematch if Joe Parker wants it, you know? So I think there's Joe Joyce. I think there's Daniel Dubois for Joseph Parker. I think that makes sense. What other fights could we see for Joe Parker? Zhili Zhang. Again, why not? Kabayel, why not? But I think Joe Parker will look for money fights. So probably, maybe Dubois may be at the top of his list. But Joe Parker's put himself in a great position once again to maybe even fight for an eliminator, something like that. But yeah, the fights I'd like to see for Joe Parker, and I know I'm mentioning the same names for a lot of these heavyweights, but regardless, the names I'd like to see Parker in there with would be the likes of a Joe Joyce rematch, Daniel Dubois, even Kabayel, those sort of guys, you know? But yeah, he's got himself in a good position. And lastly, the most boring fight on the card, Dimitri Bivol versus Lyndon Arthur. We'll start with Lyndon Arthur. He's a domestic level fighter. Go back down to domestic level. Fight a guy like Craig Richards. That's the sort of fight he should take, in my opinion. Fight a guy like Craig Richards. As for Dimitri Bivol, well, very simply put, he should fight the winner of Callum Smith versus Artur Beterbiev, so we can finally get undisputed at light heavyweight. That is the only fight, as far as I'm concerned, for Dimitri Bivol. That's the only fight. We've been waiting for far too long now to see undisputed at 175, and hopefully we get it in 2024, but we shall see. We shall see. But anyway, that's what I believe each fighter should do after their subsequent fights. I think the winner, like the come out performance or breakout performance, was from Kabayel. So credit to him. There's a couple of good fights on the card. I enjoyed, like I say, I enjoyed Makhmudov Kabayel. I enjoyed Dubois Miller. I enjoyed Joshua's performance. Wilder getting upset was interesting. So the card delivered in certain ways. There was a couple of disappointments, but yeah, overall it was decent. Anyway, share your thoughts below. Beanie Guy Del Boy. Peace.